Thank you. Thank you very much. John, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I have very fond memories of especially your mother, who taught Latin, and I sat in one of her courses and also was chair of the committee that promoted her to full professor. So I am happy to see a number of friends and even a former student, Susan Dahl, here. I'm indebted for these some of the slides to Stan Burstein at the California State College, California State University at Los Angeles, and to Steve Sodabotham at the University of Delaware, whom some of you I'm sure know. Also, I'm indebted to Janice Yellen, who is here, for some important contributions to the bibliography. By the way, John, were the handouts made available?
Oh, yes.
I have some outlines and some bibliographies in case any of you did not get them. I have a provocative title: Why the Ethiopian Eunuch in Acts 8 in the New Testament was not from Ethiopia. Well, this revolves around the problem of toponyms or place names. Toponyms of small cities tend to stay localized, whereas toponyms of large areas tend to migrate. For example, the Hebrew Ashkenaz, which is mentioned in the Old Testament, just briefly, in Jeremiah 51:27, originally meant Scythian, one of the nomadic tribes from Russia, the steppes of Russia. Today, the Hebrew term Ashkenazic for Jews refers to Jews from Europe. And that's because the later Talmud associated Ashkenaz with Germany. Likewise, another term called Sepharad, which appears in Obadiah 20, originally meant the city of Sardis in Asia Minor. But today it refers, the term Sephardic Jews refers to Jews from Spain and North Africa. Likewise, the toponym Asia originally came from the Hittite word Asua, which is a site near the city of Miletus. But later in the Roman period, it came to mean the province around the city of Ephesus. Hence, it occurs numerous times in the New Testament, which must cause some confusion to the average reader, because Asia today refers to countries in the Far East. Libya came from the Egyptian word ribu and was a general term used by the Greeks for Africa. The word Ethiopia, well, the word Africa comes from a tribe which is near the area of Carthage. Now, the key term that we're discussing today, Ethiops, comes from the Greek word which means sunburned face, referring to blacks, and mainly in the area of the Sudan. The word Sudan comes from the Arabic phrase Bilad as-Sudan, which means land of the blacks. So we turn to the passage in mind in consideration in Acts 8, 26, 27, and I'm quoting from the King James Version, which is familiar to an older audience. And this word in context means, describes an event in which Philip, who had been conducting a revival meeting in Samaria, is told by the Lord to go down to the road in Gaza, where he encountered this man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, Greek Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship. Now, this talk that I'm giving this morning is based on chapter 6 of my book, Africa in the Bible. And as I went back to my chapter, I found I had made a rather big blunder in interpreting this passage in Acts, which I now regret. And that is, I had suggested that the motive for the eunuch's travel to Jerusalem was either commercial or political or to see the wonder of the Temple of Jerusalem, which was a tourist site. When the text says very plainly he went to Jerusalem for to worship, which must mean that he must have been intrigued by Judaism, even though he could not become a full convert, a proselyte, because he was a eunuch. He was interested enough to go to Jerusalem, and he probably learned about the Septuagint from his stay, no doubt, in Alexandria. And he was reading from the Septuagint, the famous passage in Isaiah 53, which speaks about the suffering servant dying for man's sins and redemption, which Philip interpreted as Jesus, who had recently been crucified. Now, the Ethiopians themselves believed very firmly, as Professor Rodolfo Fantoni, who is here, who is excavating Ethiopia, reminds us that the Ethiopians themselves believed that the eunuch came from their country. This is expressed explicitly in the great legendary work, the Kebra Nagas, in passage 34, when the envoys who come back to Judea with Menelik, the son of the supposed union between the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, comes back to Jerusalem, and this is the time when he steals the Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian Christians believe is back in their country. He says quite clearly, we have come from the dominion of Hendake, Candace, and we are going to the country of Judah, to Solomon. Now, here are some quotations of some scholars that confirm this very firm belief. Ephraim Isaac at Princeton chronicles this, and this reference article in an encyclopedia also seems to assume this belief as a fact. Afrocentrism, I think most of you are aware, is a rather strong movement that follows the teachings of a Senegalese physicist, Sheikh Anta Diop, that seems to assume that all Africans are black. In fact, that all people in the Bible, the Old Testament, New Testament, are black. And this is shown quite clearly in a book that I'll reference in just a moment. But this is not really the case. As John Thornton mentioned, the Bible says that Moses was married to an Ethiopian woman, a Cushite woman, and that's a chapter of one of my books. Simon Cyrene, however, was probably not black. Cyrene was a Greek colony, and Simon was quite clearly Jewish. Even the term Simeon Niger does not necessarily mean that he was black in the literal sense, but it could be he was dark complexion. We know Jews who were called Niger. Now, on the other hand, there are important blacks in the Bible, perhaps none more important than this Ethiopian eunuch, who is quite clearly black from the heart of Africa. And as Afrocentric scholars have pointed out, he was the first Gentile to accept Christianity, not Cornelius, the Roman centurion who comes later in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 10, but rather this Ethiopian eunuch. Now, some of you may not be aware that there is a very large Bible called the Afrocentric Bible, Study Bible, edited by Kane Hope Felder, which has illustrations of Moses is black, Jesus is black, all the prophets is black. And there is another Bible published by the American Bible Society called the Holy Bible African American Jubilee. Well, in both of these Bibles, which have reference articles, there is no awareness that this Ethiopian eunuch came from the Sudan. Rather, an old sermon is reprinted from the 19th century, which assumes that the Ethiopian eunuch came from Ethiopia or Abyssinia. And also in in other essays in the second Bible, there is no awareness or recognition that the Ethiopian eunuch came from the Sudan. Now, the term Abyssinia goes back all the way to the time of Aksum, when the king of Aksum was called the king of the Habasha, in Arabic Al-Habasha, which became Abyssinia. And I did not realize this until I did further study recently about this, but the country we know as Ethiopia in Eastern Africa, which is believed to be Ethiopia by the Ethiopians themselves, was known to outsiders into the 20th century as Abyssinia. And this is a map that shows the Italian invasion of this country, which is labeled Abyssinia. This is in the 1930s. It was this king, King Menelik II, who established the name Ethiopia for his country. He was a chieftain who conquered areas to the south of his capital, and in his correspondence with Europeans, he said this: Ethiopia, having been for 14 centuries an island of Christians among a sea of pagans, as the Almighty has protected Ethiopia to this day, I am confident he will increase and protect it in the future. So Ethiopia is a very proud country because it was not colonized by the Europeans, and it was a Christian country in the midst of Muslims and pagans. And he insisted that this country be called Ethiopia. And so it was recognized by his grandnephew, Haile Selassie, who was the Ross of the Tafari area. And here are some other quotations about this designation of Ethiopia through the efforts of Menelik II, who was able to defeat the Italians and expand his boundaries. My colleague at Miami University, Amanda McVetti, who specialized in Ethiopia, has summarized the situation this way. Menelik II called the empire that he pulled together Ethiopia, though Europeans and Americans continued to call it Abyssinia until the 1930s and even until the 1940s. So this is the reason why modern readers today will be confused when they see Ethiopia. They think of the country which is known before the 20th century as Abyssinia. Now when we get to ancient terms, we have, and there are a number of Egyptologists here that can add to this. The Egyptians called the people who lived to the south of them in Sudan Nahasi. Nubia comes from the word, the Nuba tribe that still dwelled in the Sudan. And they called the region between the first and second cataract Wawat. And the area to the south of the second cataract, Cush, which is a loan word that is borrowed into the Hebrew Bible. Now, there is another interesting word which I would like to just add as an aside. The interesting country of Punt, Hatshepsut, about 1500 BC, sent a famous expedition to Punt to bring back some incense trees which he planted, and these are depicted in her famous mortuary shrine at Deir el-Bahri. And there's long been a puzzle as to where is this Punt. We know that it was in the Red Sea somewhere. Earlier scholars had placed it in the shores of Somalia. Kenneth Kitchen, Egyptologist from Liverpool, places it farther north in the area of the Sudan. And Professor Fatovic and Catherine Bard of Boston University could not attend this session because of her classes, but whom I will have the privilege of meeting afterwards, made a marvelous discovery on the Red Sea. The Egyptian site of Sao, where 12 dynasty stela were discovered. And so Professor Bard and Fatavik excavated the site from 2001 to 2005. They found marvelously preserved stone anchors, wooden planks, cords of rope, and even a cargo box which had wonderful things of point. And here is the site marked in red here. The Egyptians would construct the boats, take them apart, carry them through the desert, and then set sail. Now, in their monograph on this discovery, which is listed in the bibliography, Professor Bard and Fatavik speculate or suggest that perhaps Punt was in southern Arabia near the port of Aden. We know that southern Arabia, Sheba, southwest Arabia, where Yemen is today, and also Oman, had the primary sources of myrrh and frankincense trees. Here is the photograph of the cordage that was discovered at the site, and this is the cargo box with the phrase "marvelous things of Punt." Now, coming back to the interior of Egypt, we find that the geography of the Nile is such, as all of you, I believe, know, is such that sailing up to the area was facilitated by the fact that the winds were northerly. So you could sail upstream, and then you encountered a series of 6 cataracts beginning at Aswan, where the Aswan Dam was built. And then you have a series of 5 other cataracts. These are granite outcroppings that hinder navigation, such as this cataract. And these serve to define different areas of the Sudan or Nubia. Near the 4th cataract, there is this large mountain which Timothy Kendall managed to climb up to the top of the pinnacle at one end, and there's a very interesting article in National Geographic about his exploits here. But this was a sacred mountain to the Kushites. And it was somewhere near here that their early capital of Napata was located. I was just speaking with Jeremy Pope before this and asked him if he knew of any further research as to the location of the city. And he mentioned that different archaeologists have found walls, like Timothy Kendall, but not a solid evidence of the location of this great and important city, Napata. Nearby are, of course, a number of pyramid tombs. Now, in the 6th century, Psammaticus II of the 26th dynasty marched against the Kushites, and thereafter the Kushites seemed to center their capital at Meroe. Dr. Pope has a long discussion about the reasons for this. And it is from the pyramid tombs that are scattered between Napata and Meroe that George Reisner of Harvard established the relative chronology of the Merowite rulers, the basis of their pyramid tombs, some of which have inscriptions, but some of which do not. And here we have a map that shows the different cataracts. And this is the approximate location of Napata up here on the left. I can't evidently use this pointer. Let's see if I have another pointer. Well, here is Napata here on the left, and here's the 4th cataract. And then there is Meroe, which is down here between the 5th and the 6th cataract. Now, I think many of you know, and I didn't know until recently, that the country of Sudan has built a large dam upstream from Napata that has submerged much of this, just as Lake Nasser did near the first cataract, displacing many Nubians to their dismay. And there have been some salvage operations that have been connected in connection with this dam. When we get to the city of Meroe, we do have excavations that have been conducted here. The earliest excavations were conducted by John Garstang of Liverpool University. Early in the century, from 1909 to 1914, when the First World War broke out. And then more recently by Peter Shinney, who had excavated in Ghana. And there are 2 volumes of his excavations that I've listed in the bibliography. The railroad track goes right through part of the city here. There are tombs all around, and then there are a number of buildings that have been discovered. This is an artist's conception of the great city of Meroe. And a number of temples have been discovered, including this Temple of the Sun and the Temple of Amun. What's interesting is that the Kushites, after they invaded and conquered Egypt, adopted the Egyptian gods, particularly Amun, the god of Thebes. Now, in the Hellenistic period, the Ptolemies succeeded Alexander, attacked Meroe and its kingdom, first under Ptolemy I and then under Ptolemy II. And Stan Burstein has written widely on these relationships. And in his translation of Agarthacides, he comments that Greeks of all sorts, diplomats, intellectuals, artisans, and most important, Ptolemaic elephant hunters, traveled freely through the Meroe territory. At first, the Seleucids had all the elephants, and then the Ptolemies obtained their elephants from Meroe. And we have this graffiti of an elephant in one of the buildings of the Meroites. Then came the Romans into Egypt with the pursuit of Antony and Cleopatra by Octavian, who became, of course, Augustus. Cornelius Gallus, the first prefect appointed by Augustus, set up a trilingual inscription at Philae, which is by the Aswan Dam, by Aswan. Syene was the Greek name of Aswan. And there's an island called Philae, in which there are many, many temples, both of the Egyptians and later of the Greeks and the Romans. And at this time, the second governor, Cornelius Gallus, was appointed to supervise areas over the area called the Tri-Contest Koinois, 30 Koinoi, about 200 miles south of Aswan and Philae. Now, we have references to conflicts between the Romans and the Meroites at this time. Augustus ordered Aetius Gallus to attack Arabia and Meroe. And while he was away attacking Arabia, the Meroites counterattacked, and they defeated some of the Romans at Philae and carried out booty. Most notably, a superb bronze hand of Augustus, which was found at Meroe, and a painting which seems to depict Roman captives from this campaign. Let's see. Okay. The Meroitic language belongs to Northeastern Sudan branch. And let's see if I wanted to show you the site of first of all, this is a reference to Strabo and the Candace who attacked the Romans at this time, and this is no doubt probably Amanirenas, one of the 4 Candaces who has the title of Kore, or ruler. And he describes her as a woman who lost an eye. After this defeat, the Meroites were asked to go to Caesar. And then he said they didn't know where Caesar was. Well, Caesar was all the way on the island of Samos. And he graciously dismissed any indemnities, and thereafter the Romans and the Meroites lived in peace for scores of years. The fortress premise is Casa Ibrim, which was on a mountain, but today is in the middle of Lake Nasser. Now, going back to the Meroite language, the language itself is attested already in the second millennium in the Egyptian script. But an Egyptian, a distinctive Meroitic script was developed from the Egyptian, and this dates to about the 2nd century BC. So most of the inscriptions are from the very late Hellenistic and Roman period. The Egyptologist Llewellyn Griffith managed to decipher the phonetic meanings of the script, but so far, according to the latest studies, we know the meaning of only about 100 words, mainly from the burial inscriptions. Here we have the script both in hieroglyphic and in hieratic, and this includes 15 consonants, 4 vowels, and 4 syllables. Griffith thought of this as an alphabet, but the latest studies indicate that this is more of an alpha-syllabic script. We have numerous stelae, and some of them are quite long, but the best that can be made out of the royal stelae are victories and of people captured and imprisoned. And here are the few words in Meroitic which can be identified. And what is especially interesting is the word Kore, or ruler. Now, the Meroitic rulers were buried in pyramids, and these are located near Jebel Barkal, at Napata, El Kuru, Nuri, and others closer to Meroe itself. And we have experts in our audience who have worked on these, including Susan Dahl and Janice Yellen, so I'll refer any questions that you might have about these to them. But here is an example of the Meroitic pyramids from Napata, from Nuri, and from Meroe. And it is from these temple tombs that we have the names of some of the rulers. Jean Vercoeter discovered what he calls a palace of Candace at Wad Ben Naka. And we do have, in addition to the worship of Amun, the god Apedamak. And in the lion god, who is shown with multiple heads and multiple hands, and some art historians just detect an Indian influence possibly on this, and even a serpent's body. And I omitted from the bibliography the monograph by Jabkar, who taught at Brandeis, and I apologize to Professor Jabkar, who's no longer with us, but who's a teacher of Susan and Janice, for omitting that title. Now, we have, coming to the conclusion, only 4 Candaces who have the title Kore. And these include Amenemhotep, who comes in the 1st century BC, probably the queen who attacked the Romans. And then 2 other queens, Ameneshaketa and Nawidamak, and finally Amenetore. The chronology of these queens and of other rulers, of course, is in flux. And only vaguely can we date the queens, and that's why it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly which queen was a queen mentioned in the book of Acts. For example, in the case of Aminatore, who is shown here as a warrior grasping the head of prisoners while she's bashing their heads in, she is always accompanied by her king, Natakamani, who's on the other side. And although earlier scholars such as Hinsey had dated her to 12 BC to 12 CE, and Dawes Donham had dated her to 80-25-41, making her prime candidate for the Candace of the New Testament, the latest chronology by Riley and Vogt places this queen late in the 1st century or mid-1st century CE. So I don't think she's the queen of Candace of the New Testament. Two possible candidates, Nawidimak, the first half of the 1st century CE, and Amanashakheto, who's also dated by Riley the first half of CE, but we don't know for sure. And I was talking to Janice Yellen about this, and she's not sure either. So we can't be positive about this. Now, if the Ethiopian eunuch, who is described by Irenaeus, for example, in AD 180, as going back to his country to preach the gospel, and by Eusebius, a 4th century historian, about bringing the gospel to Ethiopia, did not bring the gospel to Meroe, the area of Meroe, Nubia. Who did? Well, later on we read about missionary journeys in the 6th century going to that area. And what's interesting is that under Justinian and Theodora, there were 2 rival missions that were sent to this area, to 3 kingdoms in the Sudan. Justinian was Orthodox, he believed in the Chalcedonian degree, whereas his empress was Monophysite. And they both sent rival missions to this area. Now, when we go to Aksum, which has been excavated by Professor Fatemi, we have these monumental stelae. This is, of course, in the highlands of Ethiopia. And we do know when this country was evangelized by the account of Rufinus, a church historian of the 4th century. He says there was a shipwreck, and there were 2 young boys that were shipwrecked on the port of Adulis in the coast of Eritrea, who were raised at the court, and who, when they grew up, became royal officials at the court of Aksum. And one of them then went back to Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, and asked him to send missionaries to Aksum. But instead, Rufinus himself was sent back and became the first head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which explains the anomalous situation that the head of the Ethiopic Orthodox Church until the 20th century was a Copt, not an Ethiopian himself. And we know that these 2 young boys who were raised at court were highly influential in the conversion of the Emperor Ezana, who ruled from 322 to 360 at Aksum. We have inscriptions of his in Ge'ez and in Greek, and also by the dramatic change in the symbols of his coins. In his earliest coins, we have a crescent moon above his head. And his later coins, we have a cross, just providing dramatic evidence for the conversion of Aksum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're on schedule, which is wonderful, and we're opening this up for Q&A to both of our speakers. I have to leave at 12:45, but Dr. Haywood can continue this as moderator, should it happen that we go longer than that, although we're scheduled to end when I leave. So please, questions to either of our speakers. They have a mic. Is there the mic for the audience? So this event is being recorded for podcast. And for that reason, it's important for us that anyone asking a question speak into the microphone so that it will show up clearly on the podcast when we have it done. And then the speakers will also speak into the microphone. So.
Hi, thanks very much. This is all really interesting. Jeremy, I had a question for you about the stelas that you pointed to that talked about commodities that the Kushites had gotten in the trade in Western Asia after the siege of Jerusalem. You pointed to a lot of commodities, copper and wood and things like that, which are sort of the normal things to get from that area. But you also pointed out that in the Nubian inscriptions, they don't give a lot of specific political information about that they seem to fall back on a lot of cliches about sand dwellers and things like that. So I wonder why you would take the economic information any more seriously. I mean, it sort of sounds like the sort of thing that could be just sort of cobbled together from any tribute list from the 19th or 20th dynasty.
It's a good point. Yeah, that actually is somewhat problematic. I mean, my impression in general of the inscriptions in this period, during this period, is that the analogy that I wanted to use, but I couldn't find time to fit it into my lecture, was that I felt like the way they depict the Near East is analogous to maybe an American nightly newscast depiction of Africa, right? That there's so little actual texture detail of the politics and people involved, maybe more attention to what can be obtained from the region, which make a good point that why should we take literally the claims that they obtained these things? I guess I incline towards that in large part because it might be not a representative sample, but with Kawa, there is material there, wood and copper and so on, that people have provenance as being Near Eastern. It's always a little problematic though. It's not so easy to provenance such things. But I think those are at least consistent. And it's also consistent with the fact that an item that Taharko mentions importing that I did not mention are Mentu nomads of Asia, right? Who were brought to be viticulturalists, to run the vineyards at Kawa. And there are then precisely what we'd expect. There is actually sort of a little vineyard next to the temple. So I guess it's archaeologically consistent that they would have those, they would be importing those products. I wouldn't say it's necessarily irrefutable though. It could be just as stereotyped. And honestly, I guess the surrounding evidence, the evidence we find, for instance, of Kushite items in the Near East, like the Shabako ceiling, those will have to determine how literally we take the descriptions of products. But you're quite right that in general, the depiction of the Near East is such a stereotyped affair that almost every aspect of it has to be regarded as possibly a copy of an earlier, an archaistic copy of an earlier inscription. So that's actually a really good point. I don't know that I have a convincing answer for it, except for the fact that I think I'm inclined to take the raw materials a little more literally because of the way, well, it's also because of the nature of the text that mention them. Because they're these rather boring, dry inventory lists. They don't strike one as particularly propagandistic. Like Kawa 3, it's just, I received this quantity of this product in this year. It seems as if they just copied a papyrus onto a stela. And that, I am disinclined to read that as purely propagandistic because it's so detailed and mundane. To me, that lends it a little bit of credibility.
Except for the fact that, you do have propagandistic sort of tribute lists. The annals of Tutmosis III and things like that.
Especially when they give provenance. That tends to be the most propagandistic element.
The reason I brought it up is, I wonder if there's another explanation for why the Kushites would have been interested. Maybe it's purely military strategic. Fight them there so we don't have to fight them here.
Yeah, and the article that I wrote about this, the chapter that I wrote for the book by Seth Richardson and Isaac Kalimi, Sennacherib at the Gates of Jerusalem, I ended up concluding that I thought there were two primary goals that they were after in the Near East. One was commercial interest, and the other was border defense. I'm decidedly against the idea that they were after any sort of territorial acquisition, which is surprisingly common in the secondary literature, that assertion that they were, and the assertion that if they had been successful, that that would have led to an imperial conquest of the Near East by the Kushites. I don't really buy that at all, because I don't see that as consistent with sort of the longue durée history of Kush and its political formations. Border defense, though, I think, that might be the overriding concern, especially since it seems to, their actions seem to coincide with, I'm a little reluctant to make this too synchronistic, but their actions do sometimes seem to coincide with the most recent Near Eastern threat, right? A recent Near Eastern threat, and Shabbatiko moves into the Delta. Like, those things do seem to line up relatively well. And consequently, I think border defense may be the main thing driving them. I still think commercial interest is a large part of it, though. Again, though, it is difficult to separate it from the propaganda, but I think, for instance, of like the the Karnak Pylon 6 inscription, which Argo says that, you know, he's praying to Amun and saying, please return to me the tribute of Syria-Palestine, tribute of war that was taken from me. I at least have taken that as a lament about the fact that Esarhaddon had just recently cut him off from that. But I absolutely take your point, though, that even those elements could be propagandistic. It's remarkably difficult to determine.
I had a much more trivial question. You showed the Banks manuscript and the Jebel Barkal relief and the depictions of formerly Assyrians, now Africans, and you showed Tony Spallinger's graffiti. Were those from Musarawat, or do you know where they came from?
One of them is from Berberi in North 11 that I got from Janice Yellen. That was the helmet that's very pointed, not particularly knobbed at the top, but that's one of the ones that Tony cites. Let's see, the one at lower right. The one at lower right was from Naga. It's from a pedestal at Naga, which actually has, I mean, if I could show it right now, it would be a little simple, but that was the one that had the most knob-looking
It's on a
helmet.
different computer.
That was from a pedestal at Naga that actually had a depiction of that man with the knobbed helmet, and then a man with the very, I don't know what else to call it, the very spiky hair, which does actually also then show up on the example that I showed to the left, which is also from Naga, if I remember correctly. And that was the guy with the cross straps. So I think we basically have two Naga examples and a Begaria example there. None from Musawarat that I know of, but I was piecing together images from the citations that Tony had given me in his chapter.
I was curious where they came from, but I guess if they're from Naga, then they could be contemporaneous with the 25th dynasty.
Well, honestly, I don't think any of the depictions that I showed are contemporaneous with the 20th dynasty. I think this is part of the difficulty that we have. With the 25th dynasty, all of a sudden we get a detailed iconographic and textual representation of what this, basically what's happening politically with this dynasty. We don't have hardly anything to precede that for the preceding 2 centuries. Maybe the Katamala inscription, that's a long discussion, but, and then we have a lot after that, right? For centuries after that. And the difficulty is that if the 25th dynasty has conflicts with its African neighbors during that time period, how are we to identify them if we're not previously familiar with them? And if we don't have, if they don't explicitly say, like if Bianchi doesn't explicitly say,